All right, more fun with Rudolf Steiner's Karmic investigations. Now here's an obscure individual. He keeps bringing up these people I've never heard of, and then I have to go do all this work. Steiner makes you work. He he's one of the most educated men, I think, in the history of the West. Few people realize this. The people that don't understand him or like him are the people who just don't realize the level of erudition that we're talking about here. It's off the charts. He really was, in many ways, truly the last type of individual of a Goethe or a Leonardo, somebody like that with that vast universal learning and erudition. It's pretty huge. This individual, Johann Heinrich Pastelotzi, I'd never heard of him. He was born in 1746 and died in 1827, and he was a Swiss pedagogue and kind of like Amos Comenius, an educational reformer. His past lives are kind of interesting. So, about 100 BC, Steiner says, about 100 years before the coming of Christianity, he was a slave overseer, but he was a particularly good and compassionate one. He was very literate, very learned, very cultured, and his slaves really liked him. He was nice to them, they were nice to him, and he had a good relationship with his slaves at that point. It was perfectly normal back then, Steiner points out, to have slaves. Not that he's, for it or anything, but it was a perfectly normal thing. And but this overseer had a superior officer who was extremely mean to him, very abusive, constantly on his ass about one thing or another. And so they reincarnate then, and when they reincarnate, it's in the 9th century. It's interesting how many of these lives that Steiner talks about occur between about 750 and 1050. They reincarnate only, the Pestalozzi character reincarnates now as the wife of this superior officer who was so abusive to him. So they reincarnate, and the slaves reincarnate along with them as part of a kind of a commune. So they're running like one of these communes, like we have all the way to this day, where everybody has their duties to do, and it's all equal. And the superior officer, though, himself is abused by, I don't know whether it's another superior officer or who it is who's doing the abusing. And the wife is mostly taking all this in. This is Pestalozzi, is this guy's wife, taking all this in. And they work out their karma. Steiner doesn't say how, but they work it out such that they don't have to reincarnate again together. But then Pestalozzi now reincarnates in the 18th century along with his slaves, who were members of a commune around 900 AD. Now they reincarnate as the Swiss children that he then teaches to make sure they're all literate. So that he dies in 1827, but by 1830, there's no such thing as illiteracy in Switzerland due to the achievements of this man, this extraordinary individual. Interesting how people reincarnate in groups. That's a great example of it. And so now what we'll do, we're going to look at an individual living in the time just after the murder of, let's see, where's that map? I guess it's here. Living in the time of, in the 4th century AD, in the time of Julian the Apostate, just after he had been murdered. And this individual was an initiate in the mysteries here of Asia Minor. Asia Minor was packed with mystery cults in the 4th century AD. There was all kinds of them. And now Julian was, I think in many ways, the last truly great Roman emperor. He wanted to bring paganism back. He had no intentions of exterminating Christianity, unlike, now this is around between 350 and 360, and he kept it in the closet, his love of paganism. So this is in that decade, and he has a relative, Constantius. This is the dynasty of Constantine the Great, who had just recently founded Constantinople. And Constantius is now ruling. There's been a number of intrigues and murders in the family. Julian was lucky to survive, but he did. He was mostly a loner, and he would go off and study the classics. He loved reading the classics, and he fell in love with the pagan cults. And then there was a distinction made by this time between a senior emperor and a junior emperor. The senior emperor was Constantius, and they were called an Augustus. The junior emperor was called a Caesar. And Julian the Apostate was made a junior emperor at this point and sent off on campaigns to go fight the Germans. And we saw how badly the Romans got beaten at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 A.D. They were pretty badly beaten by Arminius. But so now here, and I think Julian was a true Caesar. He goes to Germany and fights the Alemanni, a group of Germans called the Alemanni. He fights them, and he just whips their asses. I mean, he just makes, the Romans lose like 247 men. The Germans lose like 6,000 men. I mean, this guy was a Caesar. He had the military tactical strategies of a Caesar, as well as the learning and erudition of a Marcus Aurelius, who was really his model. He was trying to be the literate emperor, and he wanted to bring back the old ways. So what he did was, in Gaul, he reduced all the taxes. The poor loved him. The rich, of course, hated him. So he reduced all their taxes. Then he was fighting the Germans, and the troops wanted to make him Augustus. And eventually they did. They proclaimed him Augustus. Constantius, though, is still alive, meanwhile, and here he's in the east, dealing with the Persians, who at this time, the Parthians are gone. The Parthians had beaten the Romans quite badly. Remember the campaign of Crassus. And now they've been replaced by the Sasanian Empire, and the ruler there is, I believe it's Shapur, and Constantius is at the border here, and they're getting ready for a major battle. When they make a deal and they settle a peace, then Constantius finds out that I think it's his nephew maybe, Julian, has been made Augustus. So now we have two senior emperors. So he marches his army, he turns back, and just like the replay of Pompey and Julius Caesar, Julian comes toward him, Constantius comes from this direction, and then Constantius on the way just drops dead. Nobody knows why. I think he just got a bloody nose all of a sudden, started bleeding, couldn't stop, and then dropped dead. So then Julian is the last man standing. So now he comes out of the closet about his paganism, and he wants to bring it back. He wants to set up new pagan temples. He basically, as Spengler says in The Decline of the West, wants to make a church out of paganism, which is an interesting idea, because this is no longer, this is Magian civilization coming into being through the pseudomorphosis of the classical civilization. So he wants to create a church out of paganism with his primary god as Helios, the sun god, Apollo. That is going to be his primary god. A little bit like Akhenaten's worship of the sun, the Aten sun disk as the primary god. So that's going to be the official god. He makes all kinds of reforms at the court. He fires a lot of Christian officials and puts in their place pagan officials. And he's working very hard to bring paganism back. He's very excited about it. It will stand alongside Christianity, unlike Theodosius the Great, who completely exterminated paganism by the end of the century. So this is paganism's last stand. This is it. Then he decides to go to battle against the Persians. So this is a map of his campaign here, and here he is. He's done with Constantinople for a while and decides to leave. So marching with a huge army of 80,000 men through the Byzantine Empire on his way to Mesopotamia. And when he gets to Mesopotamia, he has this strategy of sending two contingents, one down the Tigris and one fleet of boats down the Euphrates to attack the center of the empire, which was Ctesiphon at this point. So they try to attack Ctesiphon, but they forget that they're not fighting on home ground and that this is a riverine civilization, Mesopotamia, the oldest civilization in the world, and they understand water wars, water tactics. So they unleash all these dams and dikes that completely flood the plain and make the Roman ships completely unnavigable. So they realize that it's not going to work attacking the capital, Ctesiphon. So they decide they're going to attack somewhere else, and they start to withdraw. Then they get into another battle, and during that battle, Julian makes the mistake of not wearing any armor, and a Sasanian spear goes right into him and pierces him and kills him. And he gives this eloquent speech, if it's true, at the end of his death, this beautiful speech. You can look it up. This was a very, very erudite, learned emperor, really the last great Roman emperor, I think. And so Steiner's talking about this initiate who lived during this time and experienced this tragedy sort of inwardly, because he was an initiate not in any of the Christian mysteries, but in one of the mystery cults that were in Asia Minor. Who knows? It might have been the mystery cults associated with Artemis. Who knows? So, but then he reincarnates. So he reincarnates as a woman in the early 17th century, just before the start of the 30 Years' War, which was Europe's last religious war. And it was basically a civil war within the Holy Roman Empire itself that forced it to divide itself into Lutheran states, such as the German states, versus Catholic states, such as Bavaria. It was a mess. 1618 to 1648. It was brutal, and it made a mess out of Europe. But it was its last religious war, and this individuality witnessed it all from the point of view of a woman. Steiner, as far as Steiner is concerned, women are good observers of events. I don't hear him talking about them much as thinkers, but he always has them in the position of observers. And then so when this individuality then reincarnates in the 19th century, he turns up as Ibsen. So this is the playwright Ibsen. He's born 1828 to 1906. I've read a bunch of Ibsen. He's absolutely essential reading. Peer Gynt, An Enemy of the People. Emperor and Galilean, by the way, is a play about none other than Julian the Apostate. So he carried that with him through his incarnations, that concern about Julian. A Doll's House had a gabbler which announces the new modern woman. Ghosts, The Wild Duck, When We Dead Awaken. It is a shift into realism. Most of his plays are realistic, except for Peer Gynt. But nonetheless, he straddles the 19th and 20th centuries and is essential reading. You have to read Ibsen. So there's the lifetimes of Ibsen. So now we get to two individualities. One of them extraordinarily obscure, Robert Hammerling. I've never heard of him. He's an Austrian poet who has mostly not been translated, born in 1830 and dies in 1889. And the other one is, of course, Holderlin, who was born in 1770 and 1843. So Steiner goes back and looks at their past lives, and he says, actually, these two guys were friends, and they were pupils of Plato. So they were there when Plato was teaching. You get all these various characters in Plato's dialogues, and Steiner says these are accurate reflections of the types of personalities that were in the audience, that were his pupils. He was drawing on actual personalities for those dialogues. He doesn't say if these two guys appear in the dialogues or not as personalities, but nonetheless. So Holderlin was this individual who just fell in love with all the Greek myths. He loved the Platonic ideas, but his favorite thing was the Greek myths and sagas, and he didn't really have a very strong relationship with people. He wasn't a people person. But his friend, this Robert Hammerling guy, also loved Plato, but he had a good relationship with people. He was a little more grounded. So one of them is grounded, and the other one isn't. Then he says, just in one brief sentence, that they reincarnate as women during the Italian Renaissance, during the Renaissance in Italy. He doesn't say anything about them, just that they're there as women, and or even their relationship. Then they reincarnate in the Holderlin first at the end of the 18th century. He says Holderlin incarnated a bit too early, and so we get Holderlin's concern in his wonderful plays. Anyone who knows Heidegger knows that Holderlin is his favorite poet, and we have constantly Holderlin's laments for the loss of the gods. The gods have abandoned us, and so we get in Heidegger its translation into philosophy as beings have been abandoned by being. That's the same thing as what Holderlin is saying in great poems like Bread and Wine, where the gods are gone. They have abandoned us. He's missing those heavenward flights of the gods. And so he says Holderlin incarnated a bit too early, 1770, and the other guy incarnated a bit too late. What was his dates? 1830, yeah. So what happened was that Holderlin did not fully incarnate into his body. It was a little bit like Nietzsche. He didn't fully incarnate into it. Some part of him just didn't get in there and remained outside of it, which accounts for his later insanity. He just wasn't fully present to the body. He wanted to hang on to those Platonic forms and soar with them. Whereas Hammerling incarnated too deeply into his body, according to Steiner, and as a result caused lifelong illnesses, even though he lived to be 59. But he had lifelong illnesses due to incarnating too intensely and too fully into his body. In Hammerling's plays, I guess almost none of them have been translated, are plays about, they seem to be mostly historical plays. He's got a novel, Aspasia, about the time of Periclean Athens. He's just more grounded. His feet are more on the ground than Holderlin. And so that's the story of those particular European incarnations as part of Steiner's epic history of the reincarnations of Western figures.